I would now like to invite and introduce our four distinguished panelists on stage to take their places. Associate Professor Kwok Kian Woon, faculty member in the Sociology Department, School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Nanyang Technological University. Associate Professor Eugene Tan, faculty member at the School of Law, Singapore Management University. Mr. Viswa Sadasivan, the Chief Executive Officer of Strategic Moves Private Limited. Mr. Viswa also served as a nominated Member of Parliament. Mr. Zulkifli Baharudin, Chairman of Indo-Trans Corporation. Mr. Zulkifli is a Singapore's non-resident ambassador to the People's Democratic Republic of Algeria and Republic of Uzbekistan. Mr. Zulkifli also served as a nominated Member of Parliament. I would also like to invite Mr. Gerald Singham to moderate the forum discussion. Mr. Gerald is a partner in Roddick and Davidson LLP. He is a past president of the World Law Group. Gentlemen, please.
A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, friends. It's lovely to see all of you here this morning. I often get very concerned when I have to come to this area because once you turn off the CTE and get into Ang Mo Kio Avenue, you've got to be worried about the huge institutions that are all on one road and the traffic jam that provides. But again, in a very untense, relaxed, racially harmonious society like ours, we can come through there with smiles and not with any aggro and tension. Today we are here to discuss and to share the outcomes of the survey, OnePeople.sg, very privileged to be working with IPS. It is really a historic moment because, as Janada said, it's the first time in our history, perhaps first time whether pre or post independence, that we've had such a survey. It gives us a scorecard. It provides a form of baseline for various organizations to work from, and certainly for OnePeople.sg, as we try to champion the cause of racial harmony and to be the voice of racial harmony here in Singapore. While it is a survey of perhaps the reactions and the thoughts that's been developed over the last 48 years, for me personally, I actually also see the survey more importantly as a signpost to the future. It provides us a direction. Have we arrived? For me, no. It is still work in progress, but it gives us a lot of hope and it gives us a lot of encouragement. Again, as Janadas had said in his opening, he was very encouraged, and perhaps 30 years ago, if he was asked if in 2013 we would be in this state, he would be surprised. This morning in the newspapers, I read Prof. Tommy Koh, when he talked about the 7 habits of being a good Singaporean. It was in the Straits Times this morning. He said that one of the great habits of a Singaporean is that we are very comfortable with people of different races, and we have friends of different races. And he even compared it to the melting pot of the US and said that perhaps we have closer connections and friends of other races. So this morning we're very, very privileged to have a very formidable team of panelists. All of them, in fact, need no further introduction. They're all outstanding Singaporeans who have contributed in different ways to public debate on different issues, and we're very privileged to have them here to share their thoughts, their responses, and their reflections on the survey and the survey results. I thought that before we take questions from the floor, and I'm sure there are many questions and issues that you would like to raise from the floor, and we want to be open and we want to discuss them, I thought it'd be good if we spend a few minutes from each panelist to just share with us their reflections and thoughts of the survey. And if I may, perhaps we can start with Viswa, who could share his thoughts.
Thanks, Gerald. I share the positive comments, and like Janadas, like Gerald, I'm very heartened by the general thrust of the findings. But I must admit, I am concerned that only 45% of Singaporeans, after 48 years of being independent, only 45% of us can openly say and confidently say that we have one close friend of another race. I find that, in fact, disturbing, because there's been no lack of effort. I mean, think about it, just picture it. It is actually very difficult not to have another friend, not to have one friend that you can consider close. I would say it's actually very difficult. Just as it's difficult to live in a multiracial society, have hawker centers everywhere, and not have had food of another race. Yet, we have this situation where less than 50% of the respondents have actually said, and I believe honestly, that they do not have even one friend. 55% of people said they do not have at least one friend of another race. This doesn't mean that we should be alarmed. I mean, the idea is not to be alarmed, but it should be cause for serious concern, and we should ask some inconvenient questions. What has resulted in this? I wonder if there are some structural issues. I remember speaking to quite a few of my former colleagues, friends, interns who come from SAP schools, who have, I would say, a vast majority of them have lamented, which is a good sign. They've lamented the lack of opportunity while schooling to interact with people of other races. Now, the fact that they lamented it is for me a good sign. The fact that they lamented the lack of opportunity to interact with people. But this is a structural issue. I'm wondering whether we should start addressing it. I'm not questioning the noble reasons for having the SAP school structure, because I think it has benefited us in terms of our foray into China. We have a critical mass today of young Singaporeans who are effectively bilingual in English and Mandarin, who can confidently move in to Chinese-speaking parts of the region. But what's the trade-off? And are we prepared to continue with this trade-off? Or should we start examining the structural issues like this? Similarly, I wonder if there will come a time where we will not need organizations like OnePeople.com. I think the success of One People would be when we don't need it anymore. When we won't need SINDA, Mendaki, CDAC. Will there come a time when we can actually walk without these crutches? Will there come a time when we do not need GRCs? Where we can confidently say that Singaporeans will vote on the basis of merit, by and large. My question to the rest of us here is this. If we do not try walking without the crutch, we will not be able to at a certain point. Do we have enough confidence as a people to say, let's give ourselves a chance and see if we can survive, see if we can enhance trust by trusting our basic instincts a little bit more? Thank you.
Thank you, Viswa. We'll obviously take on the points after the panelists have spoken. So perhaps now, Eugene, you would like to share your thoughts?
Thank you, Gerald. Good morning, everyone. I welcome this baseline study because I think it's important in trying to get a sense of the state of play. And I share Viswa's sentiments. That on the whole, I think we have a lot to be thankful, a lot to be grateful for. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. Yes, ethnic relations is always work in progress. But I think when you drill down into some of the indicators, I think it does suggest that we may actually be inhabiting a state of tolerance, right, rather than trying to achieve a state of appreciation and understanding of the differences that prevails. And I wonder whether structurally also, whether we tend to focus on the differences rather than trying to look at the commonalities that bind us rather than the differences that tend to divide us. So let me just try to look at one or two of the good things and one or two areas where I think there are areas of concern. I think one is the public service. I think it leads the way with its exemplary conduct with regards to trying to ensure that there's minimal minority discrimination when people access public services. And I think that's important because that sets the tone. And I think it's certainly one which I hope the private sector can emulate. The other is Singaporeans appreciated and valued the absence of interracial and religious tension. But I hope that we do not valorize, we do not place undue emphasis on harmony. Let me explain. I think harmony is certainly something that we should strive for, but harmony shouldn't be the break in which we stop trying to understand the differences, the issues that crop up from time to time. Differences and tensions will arise, and I think if they don't arise, then we are in a state of abnormality. So we shouldn't go to a stage where we get worried about tension, because if anything, we should expect tension, as I said, to be something that occurs. But rather, how do we then use this tension as a platform in which we can better understand, the differences, and try to seek a common ground, or even if we cannot accept, or rather, if we cannot bridge the difference, to at least understand where the other side is coming from, right? So tension should not be the reason for us to foreclose meaningful engagement, right, on a variety of issues. Let me just quickly talk about where I think are some of the problem areas. And I think one is certainly discrimination at work, or at least the perception that there is discrimination at work. One thing about discrimination is that it's very hard to prove, right? It is very hard to prove, and I think if the government continues to insist, that the data doesn't show that, then I think it doesn't deal with adequately with the perception on the ground. I want to talk also about the fact that certain groups seem to outperform others when it comes to the indicators, meaning that certain groups tend to do better, right? They tend to have more positive views about racial and religious harmony. So as Mathew points out, these tend to be the young, the better educated, those living in better housing types, and the non-Chinese. But I want to bring up this question of whether these responses from these groups, whether they actually are giving normative answers, right? Meaning that this is how we ought to conduct ourselves, rather than answers that are truly closer to how they feel. Whether there is a class dimension to harmony, right? Because if we take the view that as people get better off socioeconomically, their views towards racial and religious harmony would improve, then certainly we should say that we are in a better state than we are 48 years ago. I don't have any evidence, right? But anecdotally, I'm not sure that that is quite borne out. I think one would actually argue that when people who inhabit, the higher socioeconomic status, there would actually be less opportunities for them to interact. When you look at the different professional groups and all, I think we haven't quite reached the stage where there is a good representation across all the races. So I'm not really making a very coherent case, but I just want to throw out the idea of whether we might be taking the view that, well, people who come from a better socioeconomic background tend to have a more positive view. I've always taken the view that when it comes to ethnic relations in Singapore, it is important for the majority community, the ethnic Chinese, to actually take the lead in terms of trying to bridge the gaps, in trying to reach out to the minorities. Simply because when they take the lead, I think there is much less at stake. They will not be seen to be undermining the status quo. So, and of course, having the Chinese as a very dominant majority also results in the data that we find. That they find less need, less propensity to reach out to the non-Chinese. So I think this is something that is important because I think the actions of the majority, in this case, because the Chinese form 3/4 of the population, I think play a very key part. So let me just, with the indulgence of the chairman, raise this a provocative question, right, of whether we are actually sleepwalking to disharmony, right? So Janadas talks about waking up, from the nightmare. But I also wonder whether, having woken up, but because we have not completely woken up, whether we might actually be sleepwalking. And so, when you look at the lived realities, right, about 80%, only 45% had at least one close friend of another race. And I think that speaks a lot, right? Because it is the horizontal relationships that we have that ultimately will determine, the strength of the overall state of relations in this country. Because if we are not able to engage on a horizontal level with someone from another race, then it means that we then need to depend on the vertical relationship, the state coming in, right? Whether as the arbiter, the mediator. And I think this is where our evolution of ethnic relations may be somewhat stifled, right? Because the state, a lot of times we need to discuss through state-mediated platforms, right? Whether it's the IRCCs, the ethnic self-help groups. I think they do serve a valuable purpose, but I think they also raise a question of whether we become used to the fact that if we want to talk with another person from another race on a sensitive issue, we need to go through these state-mediated institutions. So I think we need to be careful of complacency and deal very resolutely with the perception of discrimination that is felt by the minority groups. Because I think when you look at the composition, we need to deal with those concerns, right? Otherwise, if they fester, I think they will not work out well for us in the long run. So, thank you. I think I've gone longer than I should.
Thank you, Eugene. Zul?
Good morning. I have 2 points. I think the first point is worth repeating, although Janadas put it more elegantly, that Singaporeans have ideologically accepted multiracialism as a way of life. Here, I would say that Singaporeans are very smart. When you ask questions, they know what answers to give. you always give the right answer. So I think most of the answers are quite correct answers. Whether they do behave in their daily lives according to what they think is another thing. I think this is something, I think there's a gap there. I mean, I hear people saying, oh, we have our hawker centers, I eat nasi padang for lunch. You can appreciate nasi padang cooked by a Malay guy. Whether that translates to something far deeper in your relationship is another matter. So I think that connection, that gap is real. So I think what you see optically and what is really deep inside you is something that only you know. But I think I'm hopeful about the future. The fact that you know what is the right answer, the chances of us doing right is far more than the chances of us doing wrong. I think that's how much we have progressed. But I think to steer, to make sure that people do the right things is something that we still have to work on. It's not enough to say, oh, they know what they're supposed to do and assume they will do it. I think we're taking a dangerous course if we leave it alone to chance. So I think that's my, my first point. The second point is, I think when you look at all surveys and results, we take comfort that the vast majority are also doing the right things. But it is not a majority that will cause problems. And I think we should focus on a minority. And when I say minority, I do not really mean a racial minority. There's also a minority within the race. And we have minorities that cuts across social lines, economic lines, and I think that's something that we have to bear in mind. And if they converge both racial and social lines, that will become more problematic. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like Viswa says, it appears it's almost impossible if you live in the heartlands, where there was a deliberate plan to ensure that your lives, at least when they converge at public places, are such that you maximize the potential for social and multiracial interaction. I think that's quite clear. And if you assume that 80% of the people live in the heartlands, you have a fair chance that 80% of the people have opportunities to interact and have a positive attitudes about the others. But even that is not so sure, because you look at the results, 20% is not a small number of people who, despite living in the heartlands, despite going down from their flat to the hawker centers to the market, still are far removed from somebody of another race. I find that very unacceptable. It's not for the, I mean, the opportunities are there, but it's not, I think maybe it's because you choose not to do it that way. The other thing is to bear in mind that there are real serious enclaves that happens in Singapore. You can live in a posh 9, 10, 11 district. Your children go to school along somewhere in the neighborhood of the 9, 10, 11. And you go to work in Raffles Place and you shop at Iron and Orchard Road. You can be completely far removed from the heartlands. I know of many people who don't go to hawker centers for food. Chinese who don't even know where, don't go to Chinatown even during Chinese New Year. It's not uncommon. Because when you have choices and you can choose to lead such a life, to be completely excluded from the others, what's wrong with that? So, until and unless, optically at least, the people at the top, people who are very successful people, are seen to be integrated racially, the rest will look at you and take directions from you. So it's not good enough for the 80% in the heartlands happy camping around with one another, but those who are really well-to-do have their lives completely removed from the rest of society. I think that's not good. I think that's dangerous. It can happen. Because those who are mixing around are people who probably don't have choices. Whereas those who don't, it's probably they have those choices which doesn't motivate them to want to mix around. So I think multiracialism, if it's to be entrenched as part of our, not only ideology, but a part of our life, is still a serious work in progress. We are not, I think, anywhere near that because the dangers are still there. And I think the real test is this. Deep in your quiet moments, when you have a problem, whether it is a personal one, or whether you are deciding to choose your son-in-law or daughter-in-law, deep down inside, and you have to decide on the issue which borders on race and religion, that's the question, and you know what's the answer. And I don't think, if we put that to a test, I'm not confident, if you look at the numbers, we have arrived. It is something we can take comfort of, but we are not anywhere near a place where we think we can say that all is well and good.
Thank you, Zul. Kian Woon, can we hear from you, and can you tell us whether you feel everything is well and good?
Well, good morning, everybody. I guess you have not seen so many numbers in any short space of time as this morning. Right? So the question is not just to interpret the numbers, but to also evaluate what the numbers are telling us. And in this question of evaluating and interpreting, you can talk about a glass being full or half empty. And there may be reasons why we want to emphasize one or the other. Because emphasizing that it's half full also gives us a sense of optimism to move into the future. Emphasizing that it's half empty keeps us on our toes, and I think I would agree with the sentiments that have been expressed, especially by Zul. When we evaluate, we cannot help but talk about values, and our values in terms of what may be called the good society, and how far Singapore is from our most cherished and deeply held views about what is the good society and for whom. So I'd like to begin first by picking up on a word that is frequently used in Singapore. Zul mentioned multiracialism. We tend to say multiculturalism a bit less. And in general, as this survey goes, there's a lot of emphasis on race. Now, social scientists are careful about the use of the word race, because race implies something biological, genetic, fixed, frozen, static. It's as if you cannot come out of your race. Whereas the term ethnicity is a concept that is more cultural or even social. The boundaries of ethnicity can be fluid, they can be porous, the situation can be quite dynamic. Even in Singapore, someone like Zul, we were joking, he gets mistaken for being a so-called Chinese racially very often. I can tell you that because I am of a certain complexion, I'm happily mistaken for a member of another race, and so on. And we do know that people can move in and out of ethnicities. So race then becomes a kind of a box that we fit people into, and this has been the case for the longest while in Singapore. I mean, people always refer to CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, others, and so on. Now, coming to religion, which is the other big theme of this survey, religion is, for the most part, for some people, something inherited, part of your upbringing. But in some cases, religion is a matter of conversion, which involves maybe a rather intense personal experience. Religion, for a number of people, can be a matter of choice. And even if you are within a religious tradition and are an adherent within religious traditions, there's also a certain breadth of ways of being religious. And of course, one also cherishes that the idea that right down at the deepest levels, people from all religions, or even just men and women of good faith and goodwill, would share something in common in terms of human values. So I think this kind of perspective needs to be discussed more. So because of race and religion understood in certain ways, in Singapore, it's almost instinctive and instinctual for us to think of race and religion, and by extension, language, as being highly sensitive matters. So there's this impression or this idea, that these could possibly be primordial dark forces, of which there's potential conflict that could possibly break up, and if you're not careful, and so on. So this idea also, there's another side to this idea, which is that at minimal, this is a kind of minimalist idea, at minimal we should have basic tolerance, right? So as long as the ships within the society sound their horns and pass through each other in the night, that is a minimal condition, right? But if we talk about what is a good society, and very often we say a good society is measured by how its minorities and its vulnerable populations, including the poor, the disabled, and so on, are treated. And hence, the great concern in Singapore with inclusiveness, I think more so today than ever before. And this idea of inclusiveness, freedom from exclusion, from discrimination, as part of a good society, I think it's really something that Singaporeans can work together for. And it could be a Singapore idea, which is not necessarily purely Singaporean. You could say that many other societies subscribe to this idea. But the achievement of this idea in real terms, I think this is something that can make Singapore stand out, and something that, a project that we can all proudly share in. I just have a few other comments, some of which have been said. The term majority and minority is actually not about numbers per se. Of course, in Singapore, it is quite clearly about numbers, and that explains many of the survey results related to, say, the Chinese or the minorities. You get certain kinds of tendencies. Majority and minority is also about resources, it's about power, it's about status, it's about all kinds of differentiating features. I mean, in South Africa during the time of apartheid, right, the whites were numerically in the minority, but in terms of everything else, this minority was the majority. So there is a certain asymmetry between majority and minority. And this leads to this idea that Eugene was talking about. There's something interesting that's happening in Singapore. We seem to be moving from multi-religious, multiracial, multicultural, to intercultural, the word that has been used in the survey. And of course, we have a long-standing inter-religious organization. So the inter part of our work here, interaction, interrelating, and so on. I would like to say that this really cannot be something, on the one hand, be top-down and somehow socially engineered or legislated. In some ways, that is important. Having a kind of formal, constitutional environment that protects, that safeguards, these are really important. But the other side of the coin, right? The kind of software, the kind of willingness to make the effort to go beyond one's comfort zone. So this is why the results concerning the public sphere are very clear. We have more than been moving in the right direction, and we can only do more there. But in the private sphere, and this is my last comment, it does seem to me that in Singapore, and this set of data should be read in connection with other kind of survey data about Singaporeans' aspirations, about Singaporean anxieties, about moving on, social mobility, and so on. The private sphere could be that one sphere that is highly protected, where we draw the lines more clearly, without this more, as I said earlier, more fluid, more porous, more dynamic kind of situation which we recognize every day, but seldom make that extra effort to go a little further and a little deeper. Thank you.
Thank you, Kian Woon. Matthew has already spoken from the rostrum, and he kind of cajoled me to say, Gerald, I won't be saying much more, but only if there's an issue which I can help to explain with regards to survey results. So Matthew, there is a question that I have for you, so which actually Viswa raised and Zul raised it, and I think it's an important point of clarification, I believe. This is the issue about 45% may not have friends of another race. But I think we need to analyze that particular finding, because if you take it as a whole, that may be the result, the 45%. But if you look at the ethnic minority, the Indians, the Malays, actually 9 out of 10 Indians or Malays actually do have a friend of another race. But mathematically, because of the large majority of Chinese, it is therefore, my question is it really a concern? Because when you have such a large majority, the chances of the Chinese, the large majority, having a Malay or Indian friend, is that really a big concern? Or in terms of any statistical finding, that is actually acceptable? So basically the question is, overall, if you take all the races together and you come up with a statistical figure, yes, Viswa, Zul is correct, it's about 45%. But ethnic minority, vast majority of them have friends of another race, and presumably it will be friends, there'll be Chinese friends. But is it really that worrying or surprising if the large majority, because there are only so few Indians or Malays in terms of the proportion with Chinese population, is it really a point of concern? And could you just clarify that based on the detailed findings?
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. We don't have a lot of basis to make comparisons. Recently, the Pew research in the US had something to do with cross-racial friendships in the US. The figures were slightly higher, right? So just this is a comparison, slightly higher. But when I look at, of course, there's a lot more in terms of American demography that kind of explains some of that. Just looking at, I think when we think about people not having a friend of another race, a close friend of another race, one has there are different reasons. One, of course, the idea that people have, they're not comfortable with another group. So I say, hey, people of this particular racial group, just far from me. I'm not comfortable with them. In this particular case, in terms of comfort level, people had high comfort levels. It only went down when it came to new Singaporeans. I think that's another issue which I think of much interest. But among local borns, whether it's Chinese or Indians, comfort was high. When I look at the table, when it comes to Eurasians, I would think that, Eurasians, because they blend pretty much different cultures, I would think that there would be very little reason why people would go out the way to say, well, I don't want to have a Eurasian friend, for instance, or intentionally try to keep away from a Eurasian friend. But the numbers are very low. And knowing that Eurasians are very friendly people, I'm sure they make a lot of effort to actually make friendships. But what happens is really because their proportion in society is very small. So obviously the chance for that kind of friendship to blossom is just not there. So so using that as as a baseline, then I would say that because we've got a lot less Indians, a lot less Malays in Singapore, then one would expect this to go down. The heartening thing, of course, when we break it down to our younger Singaporean, and one aspect of it is language. So when you look at that, because our survey also had language inside it, so I look at, generally those who are very much more English speaking would tend to have, there's a higher proportion of them, even from the majority race, who would actually have a friend of another race. So then it does tell me that, language issues, come in. And I think once when we look at a younger population, they're a lot more open. So then, to me, I don't think it's as disconcerting as maybe what we want to read from this figure.
Thank you, Matthew.